McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Welcome to the McCuistion program, and again, I'm very pleased to have a co-host. His name is Jim Falk, and he is the CEO and President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Jim, tell us what we're going to talk about on this program, young man.
Well, I think this is going to be a very interesting program. Ian Fleming's 007 and Vince Flynn's Mitch Rapp are popular romantic stereotypes of spies, but the reality of espionage today presents a very different picture. The world's second oldest profession, spying, is undergoing massive change brought about by technological advances in big data. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was, for the briefest period of time, limited cooperation between Russian and American intelligence services. That is no longer the case. Now our adversaries operate from isolated camps in Pakistan to sophisticated government agencies in Beijing. With us today to discuss our intelligence community's response are Matt DeSarno. He was recently appointed Special Agent in Charge for the Dallas Field Office, covering about half of the state of Texas. Among the positions he has held during his career was Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division, providing leadership oversight for all of the Bureau's international terrorism investigations and operations. And to provide an interesting outside perspective, we're joined by Lee Carpenter. She is the author of 2 novels, 11 Days and Red, White, and Blue, focusing on special operations in the intelligence world in the post-9/11 era. And you may have seen Mile 22, which was her first screenplay that was directed by Peter Berg and starred Mark Wahlberg. We're also going to hear from 2 CIA veterans, Jim Olson, who spent the majority of his over 30-year career with the CIA combating the Soviet Union and Russia, and Ned Price. Ned was formerly a CIA analyst, and now he is an MSNBC national security contributor. I'd like to begin, Dennis, today's program with hearing from Jim Olson to get his take on the threats to our national security.
We're in a worse position now in terms of national security than we were at the height of the Cold War. I miss the Cold War. It was neat, it was clear, we knew who the adversary was, we had deterrence. None of that applies now. Our adversaries are invisible, they are highly motivated, they're not governed by any constraints whatsoever, whether legal or moral. So the multitude of threats we have now makes it life much more difficult for us.
Now, in your book, you open up with 3 chapters where you talk about where, in your view, are the main threats. What are those countries?
China, number one, no question about it. Everybody will agree with that. Every intelligence professional will tell you China far and away is the number one national security threat. Russia hasn't gone away either, though. And the level of Russian espionage is actually higher than it was during the Cold War, but it still pales in comparison to what the Chinese are doing. And then I listed the Cubans third, because the Cubans are very aggressive, very large, and unfortunately they've been very successful in penetrating our government. They're still there.
Matt, now that we've heard from Jim Olson, give us your sense about how FBI has evolved regarding terrorism since 9/11.
Certainly, thank you. And thanks for having me. So, as you're probably aware, the mission of the FBI is to protect the American public and uphold the Constitution. And since 9/11, our primary focus has been on preventing terrorist attack in the United States, and it remains that to this day. The terrorist threat, however, has evolved pretty significantly. In the first few years following 9/11, there was a persistent externally directed threat against the United States, an effort by al-Qaeda senior leadership to conduct another spectacular attack inside the United States. The entire United States government, to include the FBI, the intelligence community as a whole, and the Department of Defense, primarily through special operations, was very focused on creating, and did a good job of creating, a large machine to collect, analyze, and act on intelligence focused on stopping foreign directed terrorist attacks. I think that effort was extremely successful. We did that for many years, and we still continue to do that today as that threat has not completely subsided. However, the threat evolved over the years to other parts of the world where we saw terrorists in Yemen, Al-Qaeda, AQAP specifically, still focused on conducting relatively sophisticated attacks against aviation and other parts of the American interests. The capabilities to conduct attacks in the homeland, in our homeland, were reduced to some extent, but never subsided. And that was still an intelligence-driven, whole-of-government approach to prevent large acts of terrorism. With the rise of ISIS and the messaging of ISIS, we started to see both threats to U.S. and persons in U.S. interests overseas, and a renewed threat against the homeland that was not necessarily externally directed, was more externally inspired or externally enabled through ISIS propaganda, mostly online propaganda. So we started to see a shift to where people inside the United States could consume propaganda, self-radicalize or radicalize in small groups or in certain places, and the message they were receiving was if you cannot travel to fight in the Holy Land, conduct attacks where you are against who you can attack. Some of those targets initially were military, police targets, and that kind of evolved into a message to conduct attacks against almost any target in the United States. That was driven primarily through social media. In the FBI, we worked very hard with private sector partners and with local law enforcement partners while continuing to work with the intelligence community to disrupt many attacks inspired by ISIS and planned inside the United States. As we move beyond ISIS physical caliphate is gone. They still exist virtually. They're still inspiring jihadis around the world. But we've also seen the newest, or the most current iteration of the terrorist threat, which is what we've seen recently with mass shootings. And that is a lone actor, self-radicalized, often multiple ideologies, multiple grievances, and really the commitment that we've seen to date is more to violence than to any specific ideology. So the challenge with that is detection.
Do you have the assets that you need, the resources?
We do, and we're working very closely. The key to that, though, is partnerships with the community, partnerships with the private sector, partnerships with local law enforcement. And we're doing well in that respect. I would say that the 2019 version of See Something, Say Something is probably more like asking people who are very close to potential attackers to actually report to law enforcement or to the FBI that something has changed with their loved one. So, for instance, we frequently see someone like an intimate partner or a mother, a parent of some kind, who may be the only person who can detect some change in a person's behavior, because we don't have a large communication stream to intercept or a large funding stream to focus on to detect the next actor.
I read that we spend probably about $60 billion a year on our intelligence services. Are we getting our money's worth? That's a question I asked Jim Olson.
I think the number one misconception about the intelligence community of the United States is that we are at the edge of the law, that we violate people's rights, that we are sometimes engaged in almost criminal activity. That's not true. People I knew were patriots. They were doing what they did because they truly believed in this country. They felt motivated to protect this country. We follow the law. There have been exceptions. Some of our people, out of overzealousness, have gotten involved in things that were illegal, and they've paid the price. There have been exposés, and that's good. But in my experience, we are honorable people doing important work. The misconceptions that you see in the media also include the fact that our lifestyle is really flamboyant and fast cars and loose women and racing through foreign capital streets. There's some of that.
But you've been known to roll out of a car to escape a Russian agent?
There's some of that. It's certainly not a dull career, but that's, I think, exaggerated. The fact that you see a lot of assassinations and dirty work and covert action, that's overdone. We're not completely divorced from that kind of activity because it's a very dangerous world, and we've got to We got to fight tough, and we do, but I think that's overplayed.
Yeah, and Jim, we both know Jim Olson. He's been around. He's spoken for your World Affairs Council. That's when you interviewed him recently. Yep. And he's a good guy. His wife, and they were both CIA case officers and did a good job. And most everybody in that area are good people, as he said, and same thing with the FBI. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention to that viewer that the most important book that you want to read about the CIA is called Legacy of Ashes, A History of the CIA. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book by Tim Weiner. And if you'll read that book, you will find that a lot of what Jim Olson said was wishes and hopes, not necessarily the case. So there's the book cover, and you will find that the history of the CIA is a history of bungling in many cases, and unfortunately killing people and other governments around the world, covert operations. And let's just say the jury is out on how effective politically in particular that they've been.
Well, that's one take, but Lee Carpenter has had a great exposure to both special forces and intelligence officers, and she's taking it in a different way because she's writing novels. And Lee, I'd love to hear really what drives you to write your books the way you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Let me say one thing about that title, Legacy of Ashes, with complete respect to Tim Weiner, because I have enormous admiration for that book. But my recollection is that he himself has said that the reason the title of the book is Legacy of Ashes is that it could not be anything else. Because when you're thinking about a community who is defined by its ethos of discretion and secrecy and covert activity, you will only ever see on the public record the failures. Successes are private. Successes are classified. I myself had an experience of, after my father died, learning about an operation that he was involved in only because it had eventually become declassified. So I think you have an interesting challenge when looking at these communities that tend not to speak about themselves, and we tend only to hear about them when something goes wrong. But I wrote my first book because I was interested in war and how the definition of war has changed. And, I had seen what I felt like was my generation of veterans and these wars presented in a lot of stereotypes. I tried to do things differently with my first book, and after that came out and was well received in that community, I got the chance to go to Langley and start to speak to people in that community. And again, I was trying to understand sort of how has the job changed and what is the character and emotional experience of the folks who go into this admittedly very fascinating line of work. But, Bond is a myth and Bourne is a myth, and I thought I could maybe tell the story of a real case officer who had lived through some of the moral complexities that came up in the post 9/11 era.
Lee, let me ask you this. I read your book, and I encourage people to do so, but why did you place the book, say, in China rather than in Russia or the Middle East?
Well, back to Jim, you're saying China, China, China. I had very early on in my research, I was able to speak to a case officer who had served in China ops, and he said to me, I ruthlessly stole, as novelists do, and put in the book, he said, Lee, terrorism is checkers, and China is chess. And, really got me thinking about this question of time, how we think about time in terms of the wars we're fighting, and how we think long range with different kinds of enemies and maybe shorter range with other kinds of enemies. The New York Times published a podcast to much acclaim last year called Caliphate. And if you listen to that podcast, you realize that some of the folks who made the decision to join up with ISIS do not fit the traditional definition of warrior, nor does that conflict fit the traditional definition of a war, back to, vans racing down Parisian streets with bombs. Wars don't have neat starts and finishes anymore. And I wanted to look at a very kind of old war that seemed to me to be becoming more front and center. I started my research for the book in 2013, and between 2013 and when the book was published, last year, the conversations around China certainly had evolved.
Good. Thank you. So, Matt, you wrote a good article that got a lot of attention a few months ago in the Dallas Morning News about China. It was quite a warning.
It was an op-ed co-authored with the U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Texas, Aaron Neely Cox. It was a message about economic espionage, specifically economic espionage sponsored by the Chinese government under the control of the Communist Party. The message is, and the message here is that the government of China is sponsoring legal and illicit acquisition of U.S. technology, U.S. trade secrets, sometimes on the very high end relative to defense systems, sometimes on the very routine end related to the formula for white paint. The model is rob, replicate, replace. So take the technology, try to understand the technology, and then replace the market with Chinese goods.
Give an example of some technology that has been poached.
For example, I mentioned the formula for white paint, so we can go as simple as that. Typically through the use of an insider in private sector, the Chinese government will sponsor the theft of intellectual property, transfer it back through intelligence channels, try to understand the technology, whether it's the formula for white paint or some component of an aerospace system, and then replace the market share. The goal, the stated goal of the government of China is by 2025 to have market share dominance in 10 critical sectors that include aerospace and defense.
Okay, good. So what is the FBI's role? Corporate America obviously is fighting this all the time, as you know.
Certainly.
Where does the FBI come into this, and do you sort of partner with the private sector? How does this work?
Certainly. The FBI is the lead counterintelligence agency in the country. So any intelligence operations being conducted inside the United States, that's a violation of U.S. law. The FBI is the lead investigative entity for that. So we partner with private sector, with intelligence community partners, in some cases with local law enforcement, to identify traditional intelligence operations, and then the more non-traditional intelligence operations like economic espionage or the use of talent programs in universities to steal trade secrets or other intellectual property.
Mm-hmm. Now, the title of this program is 21st Century Spying, How Intelligent is Our Intelligence? So on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rank it right now in terms of how intelligent our intelligence is?
Well, the FBI is critically focused on being innovative to counter formidable adversaries. So, we heard China mentioned, we heard Russia mentioned, we've heard Cuba mentioned, we've heard terrorist organizations mentioned. There are obviously criminal entities that are using the internet to change the way they do business.
Drug cartels too.
Drug cartels,
sure.
You got cryptocurrency, darknet, end-to-end encrypted communications apps. So the bottom line is, more important, I think, than I can't really grade the level of intelligence of the entire community, but the key is the focus on the evolution of our partnerships and the innovation of our techniques to ensure that we stay with or ahead of the threats that are formidable and evolving.
Matt, you talked about partnerships, and in September, I think it was early September, the New York Times ran an article, actually it was a long op-ed piece by Glenn Gershell. He's the general counsel for the National Security Agency. And it was really quite interesting because the title of it was, "We Need to Prepare for War." And he highlighted a few issues. Massive technological change, big data in the hands of private and public sectors, cyber conflict. And he really said that there was a need for the government to work more effectively with corporations. Is that indeed the challenge that we see?
It's certainly a focus for us. We use our Domestic Security Alliance Council, DSAC, and our InfraGard programs to create meaningful partnerships with the private sector. The vast majority of the critical infrastructure of this country is in the hands of the private sector. And it's important to us, to our DHS partners, to our intelligence community partners, to have productive private sector partnerships to ensure that we're getting the information that we need and we're able to pass the information to the right people to prevent these threats from occurring.
Now, unfortunately, there have been several instances, and it seems like they're more frequent now than before, of people who commit treason against the United States. and one that certainly got a lot of attention was Edward Snowden. I wonder if we might hear what Jim Olson had to say about Edward Snowden.
I give Edward Snowden some grudging credit for believing that he had an obligation to blow the whistle on what he saw as a illegal activity on the part of the government.
Was he correct?
No, he had no right to do that. What was being done by NSA and by the CIA was not illegal under our laws. It was aggressive. Spying on friends is something that some people can't accept, but he caused grave damage to our country by taking it upon himself to reveal that information. I feel nothing but contempt for Edward Snowden and people like him.
You think he ought to come to the United States and be tried?
I would love it. I would love it. I don't think he's ever going to come back, though.
You know, one does have to understand what is the motivation. Is it money, ego, ideology? Let's hear another.
Yeah, we're going to have another clip, and the guy you interviewed was Ned Price.
Ned
Tell
Price.
him who Ned Price is.
Well, Ned Price worked as an analyst at the CIA for a number of years, and then he moved over to the National Security Council and was a special assistant to President Obama. And now he's an MSNBC correspondent, contributor.
When people call Edward Snowden a whistleblower, it always stiffens my spine a bit because he did not follow the prescribed protocols that exist for whistleblowers, for the variety of whistleblowers that he claims to be. He did not go to the Inspector General. He did not go to the General Counsel. He did not go to Congress with any substantive matters. Instead, he absconded first to Hong Kong, essentially surrounded by Chinese authorities, and later to Moscow, taking into his own hands hundreds of thousands of files, some of which were extraordinarily sensitive, and making the judgment himself as to what the American people should see. As I said before, I think the American people have a tremendous right to know what's being done in their name, but those decisions shouldn't rest with one individual, certainly not with one contractor who's not able to see the entire waterfront. So I think what he did and what others after him did was extraordinarily dangerous, and I fear we're going to see many more of these instances going forward.
Well, as you might imagine, we have more than one opinion on that. We did a program, two programs actually, on Ed Snowden. We interviewed Glenn Greenwald, who wrote the book about Ed Snowden and who was in the Hong Kong hotel room with Ed Snowden. And we had a lawyer on there named Chip Babcock, and we were talking about one of the things Jim Olson just said is that the U.S. government didn't do anything illegal. Let's hear what Chip Babcock has to say about that.
So does it bother you that that the government was doing all this surveillance that they said they weren't doing, number one, and then Mr. Clapper, as I recall his name, lied to Congress. So what? I mean, so what? They lie to Congress. Our own bureaucrats lie to Congress. That doesn't matter. Does it bother you? And what would you have done if you were Edward Snowden?
Yeah, it bothers me a little bit. The government spent millions of dollars prosecuting a former baseball player, Roger Clemens, who was also a client of mine, for allegedly lying to Congress over whether a pitcher is taking steroids. And yet government officials seem to be able to say whatever they want without consequences. I think it is significant that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, the United States Federal Second Circuit, has declared part of the program that Mr. Snowden revealed as illegal, unconstitutional. And it seems to me that weighs somewhat in Mr. Snowden's favor.
Yeah, and the problem that we have is that it's there are a lot of people who don't trust their own government for obvious reasons. The going to war in Iraq in 2003, let's say it was poor intelligence. It might have been other things, I'm not sure. And a lady named Catherine Gunn, of course, was asked to help frame some members of the United Nations Security Council into voting in favor of it. She became a whistleblower. They just made a movie about her as well. So we have to be careful whether the government steps over their boundaries as well. And I know you guys are always focused on what the letter of the law is, am I right?
We certainly are. I mean, we were focused on process. The second part of our mission statement is upholding the Constitution. We take whistleblower complaints very seriously, and whistleblower complaints, as Ned said, should be brought through the proper channels, and we'll get attention that way.
You know, we just have another minute, and I do want to bring Lee back in. Lee, you've done so much thinking and talking with people about the psychology and the morality of espionage. Give us a sense of how someone who is working to recruit a CIA asset reconciles morality as well with the job that they have to do.
Okay, I just briefly wanted to say on the Snowden question, I think it was our Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who said, "Gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail." And when I once repeated that quote to a case officer in China Ops, he said, "Well, gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail until the other gentleman flips off the lights at the Super Bowl and it scares everyone. Then you might start reading their mail." What I found with the folks that I spoke with was that the moral calculus, back to the essential idea that folks who go into this line of work are patriots. You know, there are many different lines of work to going into the intelligence world and going into special operations, which were the two communities that I've spent some time in. These are not easy career paths. And my experience has been that most people do it with a very, very good heart, and because they love this country. And they deal with the moral complexity by, remembering that the goal at the end is to try and keep Americans safe. And again, how you get to that goal has changed a lot. Everyone else in the room here knows probably more about it than I do. But
right.
But the costs are pretty high.
Thank you, Lee. And
thank you.
While the Cold War is a distant memory, so too are the hopes that followed. Matt, I want to really thank you for being with us, and Lee as well. And as long as men and women are motivated by money, ego, and ideology, they're going to be spies. The threats our nation faces changes continuously, making it even more essential that we not shortchange our intelligence capabilities. For the best defense is a strong offense, with intelligent oversight to guarantee the protection of our individual freedoms and values. We want to thank all of you for watching, and as always, Dennis and I are talking about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.